Commander Bolt Garrison had seen many things in his 38 years of military service. He'd witnessed stellar wars that lasted decades, diplomatic incidents that nearly ended civilizations, and training accidents that defied the laws of physics. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the sound currently reverberating through the corridors of Nexus Prime Academy. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. The howling started at dawn, when the station's artificial sunrise began its gentle illumination cycle. It was a deep, mournful sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, as if the station had developed a case of cosmic indigestion. Bolt rubbed his temples and glanced at his chronometer. Day 18 of what the Academy's official records diplomatically termed the Ursid Integration Program. 18 days of hell would have been more accurate. Sir? His aide, a nervous crystalline named Vex, whose translucent body flickered with stress patterns, materialized in his doorway. The howling has increased in intensity by 12% since yesterday. The aquatic cadets in Section 9 are requesting relocation to the deep-water training facilities until further notice. Bolt didn't look up from his reports. 3 more formal complaints from the Saurian delegation. 2 requests for emergency transfers from human instructors. 1 resignation letter from Tull, the Academy's most decorated combat swimming instructor, who claimed he'd rather face a nest of void serpents than endure another day of what he described as that infernal wailing. "Have we tried the sonic dampeners again?" Bolt asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Cubs destroyed them," Vex replied, their form shifting to a particularly agitated shade of amber. "Along with the reinforced training equipment, the specialized furniture, and what remained of Instructor Block 9's sanity." The howling crescendoed, and somewhere in the distance, something expensive-sounding crashed to the floor. Bolt closed his eyes and wondered, not for the first time, why he'd ever accepted this posting. When the Galactic Military Academy had been established on Nexus Prime, it was supposed to be the crown jewel of interstellar cooperation. Representatives from 43 different species, all training together in perfect harmony. That was before the Ursids decided to send their young. The door chimed again, and another figure entered without waiting for permission. General Thane of the Saurian Empire strode in with the confident swagger of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with superior firepower and rigid discipline. His scaled hide gleamed under the station's lighting, and his reptilian eyes held that particular gleam that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. "Garrison," Thane's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "This situation has become intolerable. My cadets cannot focus on their tactical studies with that constant noise. The Ursid Cubs are a disruption to proper military order." Bolt gestured to the chair across from his desk, though he knew Thane would remain standing. Saurians considered sitting during official discussions a sign of weakness. "General, I'm aware of the challenges we're facing. The Cubs are still adjusting to life away from their home world." "Adjusting?" Thane's laugh was more of a bark. "Commander, they've turned Level 3 into a disaster zone. Yesterday, they somehow managed to get into the weapons storage facility and used plasma rifles as chew toys. Chew toys, Garrison!" The howling intensified again, accompanied by what sounded like furniture being systematically destroyed. Vex's crystalline form turned a deep red, which Bolt had learned indicated extreme distress. "Perhaps," Thane continued, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that Saurians used when they were about to suggest something particularly violent. It's time to implement proper disciplinary measures. A few days in solitary confinement might teach them the meaning of respect. They're children, Thane. Bolt's voice carried a warning edge. Cubs, barely past weaning age by Ursid standards. We can't treat them like adult military personnel. Then, perhaps, Thane's tail lashed behind him, a sure sign of irritation. The Ursid High Council should have waited until their offspring were mature enough for military training. This academy has protocols, Commander. Standards. We cannot make exceptions simply because a species chooses to send infants to warrior school. Before Bolt could respond, his communication system crackled to life. The voice that emerged belonged to Medical Officer Nix, a highly efficient insectoid whose compound eyes missed nothing and whose patience was legendary throughout the academy. Commander, Nix's voice buzzed with controlled frustration. I need to speak with you immediately. The Cubs have somehow gotten into the medical bay and are currently using my regeneration tanks as swimming pools. Also, they appear to have eaten my entire supply of NutriPaste. All of it, including the flavors specifically formulated for species with sulfur-based metabolisms. Bolt looked at Thane, whose expression clearly conveyed, I told you so, without the need for words. The howling reached a new crescendo, and this time it was joined by what sounded like multiple voices raised in some kind of primitive battle chant. Sir! Another voice crackled over the comm system. This one belonged to Lieutenant Faye Winters, the Academy's newest instructor, and, according to her service record, one of the few humans with experience in what the military euphemistically called Special Population Management. I'm outside the Cubs' quarters. I think I might be able to help. Thane's laugh was particularly unpleasant. A human thinks she can succeed where proper military discipline has failed? Commander, with all due respect to our junior partners in the Galactic Alliance, perhaps this situation requires more experienced handling. Bolt studied Thane for a long moment. The general's skepticism toward human capabilities was well documented, though he was careful never to express it in terms that would violate the Alliance's anti-discrimination protocols. But his meaning was clear. Humans were new to the galactic community, untested in military leadership, and certainly not qualified to handle a crisis of this magnitude. Lieutenant Winters, Bolt spoke into his comm unit, report to my office immediately. General Thane was just leaving. Thane's eyes narrowed, but he knew better than to push the matter further. Very well, Commander. But when this human experiment fails, and it will fail, I trust you'll remember that proper Saurian methods were available and declined. After Thane departed, leaving behind the faint scent of ozone that all Saurians carried, Bolt found himself alone with the howling and his increasingly frayed nerves. Vex remained in the corner, their crystalline form now cycling through colors that Bolt didn't recognize, but assumed weren't good. The door chimed again, and Lieutenant Faye Winters entered. She was younger than Bolt had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of calm demeanor that suggested she'd dealt with chaos before. Her uniform was crisp, her posture perfect, but there was something in her eyes, a warmth that was distinctly human and distinctly at odds with standard military bearing. Sir, she said, offering a precise salute, I've been monitoring the situation with the Ursid Cubs. I believe I may have some insights that could help resolve the current difficulties. Bolt gestured to the chair Thane had refused. Faye sat with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with authority, but not intimidated by it. Lieutenant, your service record indicates experience with challenging populations. Care to elaborate? Faye's smile was slight, but genuine. Before joining the military, sir, I spent 8 years as a teacher on Earth. Elementary education, primarily working with children who had experienced trauma or separation anxiety. When Earth joined the Alliance and military service became mandatory for integration specialists, I thought my background might translate well to multi-species instruction. Another crash echoed through the station, followed by what sounded like something large and furry bouncing off a wall. Vex's crystalline form turned a shade of purple that Bolt was fairly certain meant impending nervous breakdown. "Lieutenant," Bolt said carefully, "these aren't human children. They're Ursid cubs. Adult Ursids stand 3 meters tall and can tear through reinforced steel with their bare claws. These children are already half that size and apparently have similar destructive capabilities." "Yes, sir," Faye nodded, "but they're still children. And from what I've observed, they're displaying classic signs of separation anxiety and stress-induced behavioral regression. In my experience, punishment only makes these symptoms worse." The howling had taken on a different quality now. Less aggressive, more plaintive. It was the sound of creatures in genuine distress, and even through the station's reinforced walls, it carried an emotional weight that was impossible to ignore. "The previous approaches have focused on containment and discipline," Faye continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone presenting a carefully considered analysis. "But if these cubs are experiencing trauma from being separated from their pack structure for the first time, they need comfort and stability, not punishment." Bolt studied the young lieutenant. There was something compelling about her confidence, a quiet certainty that suggested she knew exactly what she was talking about. It was also possible that she was completely insane and about to become the latest casualty in what was rapidly becoming the Academy's most spectacular failure. "What are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" "Give me 24 hours with them," Faye said simply. "No other instructors, no interference, no protocol requirements. Just me and the cubs. If I can't show significant improvement in their behavior by this time tomorrow, you can implement whatever disciplinary measures General Thane has in mind." The howling suddenly stopped. The silence was so abrupt and so complete that it felt unnatural, as if the station itself was holding its breath. Vex's crystalline form stopped cycling through colors entirely, frozen in what appeared to be shock. "Lieutenant," Bolt said slowly, "if you're wrong about this, those cubs could seriously injure or kill you. Adult supervision exists for a reason." Faye's smile was calm and utterly untroubled. "Sir, I've handled rooms full of homesick 6-year-olds having simultaneous meltdowns. I think I can manage a few lonely bear cubs who just want their parents." In the sudden quiet, Bolt could hear his own heartbeat. The Academy's entire future might well depend on whether this young human woman understood alien psychology better than trained military specialists from species with thousands of years of warfare experience. It was either the most brilliant gamble he'd ever approved or the most spectacular mistake of his career. 24 hours, Lieutenant," he said finally, "and may whatever gods you humans pray to help us all." The door to the Cubs' quarters had been reinforced 3 times since their arrival. What had once been standard military housing now resembled a maximum security containment facility, complete with blast-resistant walls and emergency lockdown protocols. Faye stood outside, listening to the sounds within, snuffling, whimpering, and the occasional thud of something heavy hitting the floor. She took a deep breath and entered her override code. The scene that greeted her would have sent most instructors running for backup. The room looked like a natural disaster had been invited to a furniture store and decided to throw a party. Bedding was shredded into confetti-sized pieces. Wall panels hung at odd angles, and what remained of the standard-issue furniture had been arranged into something that vaguely resembled a fort. In the center of the chaos sat 6 Ursid cubs, each roughly the size of a human adult, but with the unmistakable body language of frightened children. Their thick, dark fur was matted and unkempt, their large eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. The largest of them, a male who couldn't have been more than the equivalent of a human 8-year-old, spotted Faye first and issued a warning growl that was clearly meant to be intimidating, but came out more like a squeaky toy. "Hello there," Faye said quietly, settling herself cross-legged on the floor just inside the doorway. She made no move to approach them, instead adopting the relaxed posture she'd used countless times with frightened human children. "I'm Faye. I'm here to help." The cubs clustered together, a defensive formation that was both touching and heartbreaking. They were trying so hard to be brave, to live up to their species' reputation for ferocity, but they were clearly overwhelmed and homesick. "You know," Faye continued conversationally, "when I was about your age, my parents sent me to stay with my grandmother for a whole month. I cried every night for the first week because everything smelled wrong, and the beds were too hard, and I missed my mom's goodnight songs." One of the smaller cubs, a female with slightly lighter fur, tilted her head with obvious curiosity. Cubs, regardless of species, were apparently hardwired to respond to stories. Faye had done her homework on Ursid culture during her brief orientation period. What she'd learned had only confirmed her suspicions about what was really happening here. Ursids were pack-oriented creatures who lived in extended family groups called circles. Cubs remained with their birth circle until well into adolescence, learning through observation and play rather than formal instruction. Removing them from this environment was like expecting human children to thrive after being suddenly separated from everything familiar and comforting. "The thing about being away from home," Faye said, slowly reaching into her jacket pocket, "is that it helps to have something that reminds you of the good stuff." She pulled out a small device that looked like a standard translator unit, but had been modified with additional speakers. "I've been talking to some people about your home world. Want to hear something interesting?" She activated the device, and the room filled with a sound that made all 6 cubs freeze in place. It was a deep, rhythmic humming, the sound of adult Ursid voices singing the traditional evening songs that parents used to help their young settle down for sleep. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The largest cub's aggressive posture melted away, and he let out a soft whimper that was purely childlike. The female with the lighter fur actually took a step forward, her nose twitching as if she could smell home in the sound. "I know it's not the same as having your families here," Faye said gently, "but I thought you might like to hear something familiar while we figure out how to make this place feel a little more like home." The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, the cubs had arranged themselves in a loose circle around Faye, still maintaining some distance, but clearly interested in this strange human who seemed to understand something that all the other instructors had missed. "My name is Faye," she repeated, pointing to herself. "Can you tell me your names?" The largest cub regarded her for a long moment, then tapped his chest with one enormous paw. "Fen," he said in heavily accented Standard Galactic. The others followed suit. The female with the lighter fur was Mao. There was Grix, who appeared to be the youngest and kept trying to hide behind the others. 3 more introduced themselves with names that Faye carefully repeated back to them, wanting to make sure she pronounced each one correctly. "Fen, Mao, Grix," she said, nodding to each in turn. "Those are beautiful names. On my world, we have a saying, 'The pack that eats together learns together. Are you hungry? The question sparked immediate interest. Whatever else had been going wrong, it was clear that the cubs' nutritional needs weren't being properly met. Faye activated her communication unit. Medical Bay, this is Lieutenant Faye. Could you prepare 6 portions of the high-protein, high-fat ration mixture recommended for growing ursids? And could you add some of the synthetic honey substitute? I know it's not standard, but I think our guests might appreciate the familiar taste. Nix's buzzing voice crackled through the speaker. Lieutenant, the cubs consumed my entire food stores yesterday. I'm not sure they need additional rations. They were stress-eating, Faye replied, watching as Fenn's ears perked up at the mention of honey. Trust me on this. And could you have it delivered to the main recreation area instead of their quarters? I think a change of scenery might do everyone some good. While they waited for the food, Faye began the delicate process of actually talking to the cubs rather than at them. She learned that they'd been selected for the academy program based on their high intelligence and physical capabilities, but no one had bothered to explain to them what that meant in practical terms. They'd been told they were going to warrior school, but their understanding of warfare was limited to the heroic stories their elders told around evening fires. The reality of military discipline, rigid schedules, and constant supervision by unfamiliar aliens had been overwhelming. They'd acted out not from malice, but from fear and confusion. The thing is, Faye explained as she led them toward the recreation area, you're all incredibly brave. Do you know how I know that? Grix, who had been trailing behind the group, looked up with obvious curiosity. Because you're here, Faye said simply. You left everything you knew to try something completely new and difficult. That takes more courage than most adults have. The recreation area was a vast, multi-purpose space designed to accommodate the physical needs of dozens of different species. It was currently empty. Other cadets had learned to avoid areas where the cubs might appear, which made it perfect for Faye's purposes. When the food arrived, delivered by a nervous aide who left it just inside the door, and retreated quickly, Faye did something that would have horrified every military instructor in the academy. She sat on the floor and invited the cubs to join her for what was essentially a picnic. On Ursid Prime, she said, as they arranged themselves around the food containers, do you eat together as a group? Circle eating, Mao said, her standard galactic improving as she relaxed. All together, share stories, share food, make bonds strong. Then that's what we'll do, Faye replied. Tell me about your circle. What do you miss most? What followed was 20 minutes of the most revealing intelligence the Academy had gathered since the Cubs' arrival. It wasn't that they were homesick for their planet. They were grieving the loss of their pack bonds, the complex social connections that defined their entire existence. As they ate and talked, Faye began to understand the magnitude of the mistake the Academy had made. These cubs weren't just students who happened to be young. They were children whose entire psychological development depended on maintained pack structures. Isolating them from those bonds wasn't just cruel. It was functionally impossible for their species to thrive under such conditions. The sound of approaching footsteps made all 6 cubs tense immediately. General Thane appeared in the doorway, his expression one of barely contained disgust as he took in the scene. A human instructor sitting on the floor, sharing a meal with alien cubs who were supposed to be in disciplinary containment. Lieutenant, Thane's voice carried the particular chill that Saurians used when they were about to deliver what they considered a killing blow. This is highly irregular. Military personnel do not sit on floors with their charges. There are protocols for meal times, designated areas for instruction, and appropriate boundaries that must be maintained. Faye looked up calmly, not moving from her position among the cubs. "General, the cubs and I were just discussing their cultural background and how we might adapt their training to be more effective." "Adapt?" Thane's tail lashed behind him. "Lieutenant, military training has been refined over millennia by species far more experienced in warfare than humans. These cubs need discipline, not coddling." Before Faye could respond, something unexpected happened. Fen, the largest of the cubs, positioned himself slightly in front of her, in what was unmistakably a protective stance. His growl was low and serious, nothing like the squeaky attempts at intimidation from earlier. "Faye is pack friend," he said carefully. "No hurt pack friend." The other cubs immediately moved to support positions around both Fen and Faye. It wasn't an attack formation. It was a defensive one, the kind that adult Ursids used to protect vulnerable members of their circle. Thane's eyes widened slightly. In all his years of military service, he'd never seen Ursid cubs display protective behavior toward anyone outside their immediate family group. It was, according to every xenobiology text he'd studied, supposed to be impossible. "Interesting," he said finally. "It appears your unorthodox methods have produced some results, Lieutenant. The cubs seem to have bonded with you." What Thane didn't say, but what Faye could read clearly in his expression, was that he considered this a temporary novelty rather than a genuine solution. Cubs bonding with one human instructor was not the same as successfully integrating into a multi-species military academy. After Thane left, Faye gathered the cubs around her for what she privately thought of as the real conversation. "Listen carefully," she said, "because what I'm about to tell you is very important. You're not just here to learn how to be warriors. You're here to show everyone that your people can work alongside other species in the Galactic Alliance. That means you're representing your entire world." The cubs exchanged glances, clearly processing this information. "But here's the thing," Faye continued. "You can't do that alone. Nobody can. Warriors fight in units, in teams, because that's how you stay alive and protect the people you care about. We need to build you a new kind of circle here, one that includes other species." It was an ambitious plan, and one that flew in the face of every established protocol the Academy had. But as Faye looked at these 6 frightened, homesick cubs who had just shown their first spark of genuine courage, she knew it was their only chance at success. The real test would come when she had to convince Commander Bolt and the rest of the Academy that everything they thought they knew about military training was about to change. The emergency meeting was called at 0600 hours, which in Bolt's experience meant that someone very important was very angry about something very expensive. He arrived at the conference room to find representatives from the Ursid High Council flickering on the main holographic display, their massive forms somehow managing to convey displeasure even through subspace transmission. "Commander Bolt," the lead counselor's voice rumbled through the translation matrix, "we have received disturbing reports about the treatment of our cubs. General Thane has submitted a formal complaint regarding what he terms inappropriate fraternization between human personnel and our offspring." Bolt glanced at Thane, who sat rigid in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who had just delivered a perfectly timed tactical strike. The Saurian had clearly been busy during the night shift, compiling reports and filing complaints with surgical precision. "Counselor," Bolt began carefully, "Lieutenant Faye has made remarkable progress with the cubs in just 24 hours. They've stopped the destructive behaviors and begun responding positively to instruction." "By abandoning all military protocol," Thane interjected smoothly. "The lieutenant sits on floors with her charges, shares meals in inappropriate settings, and has created what can only be described as an unprofessional emotional attachment. This is not military training. It's daycare, with delusions of grandeur. The Ursid counselor's eyes narrowed, which was never a good sign when dealing with a species that could literally tear through reinforced steel. General Thane, are you suggesting that caring for the emotional well-being of young warriors is somehow inappropriate? Thane's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Criticizing Ursid child-rearing practices to actual Ursids was the kind of diplomatic mistake that could end careers. Not at all, Counselor, he recovered quickly. However, military academies have established protocols for a reason. Individual attention and emotional coddling do not prepare young warriors for the realities of combat. What happens when Lieutenant Fay is no longer available? Do the Cubs simply stop functioning? It was, Bolt had to admit, a fair question, and one that was about to be answered in the most dramatic way possible. Commander! Vex's crystalline form materialized in the doorway, cycling through colors that Bolt now recognized as panic. We have a situation. Lieutenant Fay has been called away on emergency medical leave. Family emergency on Earth. She left on the last transport 20 minutes ago. The silence in the conference room was deafening. Then, from somewhere deep within the station, came a sound that made everyone freeze. It was the howling again, but worse, deeper, more anguished, and carrying a note of genuine distress that was impossible to ignore. The Cubs know she's gone, Vex continued, their form now a deep red that indicated extreme alarm. They're not taking it well. What followed was 18 hours of absolute chaos that made the Cubs' previous behavior look like a minor disciplinary issue. They didn't just howl, they keened, a mourning cry that carried through every level of the station and seemed to resonate in the very bones of anyone who heard it. They refused food, destroyed anything that reminded them of Fay, and worst of all, they began to withdraw completely from any contact with other species. By hour 12, other cadets were requesting emergency transfers. By hour 16, 3 different species had filed formal complaints with the Galactic Alliance. By hour 18, even Thane was beginning to look concerned. Sir, Tull's aquatic voice bubbled through the communication system. The Cubs have somehow gotten into the main environmental systems. They've turned Level 5 into what appears to be a replica of their home world's climate. It's currently 93 degrees with 80% humidity, and they've somehow introduced what I can only describe as the smell of a primordial forest. Bolt rubbed his temples and wondered if it was too late to request a transfer to a nice, quiet border patrol assignment. How did they access environmental controls? Unknown, sir. But they've also rerouted the acoustic dampening systems to broadcast their distress calls throughout the entire station. Every speaker, every communication panel, every emergency alert system is now transmitting the sound of 6 homesick Cubs crying for their human. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Cubs hadn't just bonded with Fay. They'd imprinted on her so completely that her absence triggered what could only be described as a psychological crisis. It was exactly the kind of emotional dependency that military training was supposed to prevent. Commander, the Ursid counselor's voice carried a note of genuine concern. Our Cubs have never displayed this level of distress, even when separated from their birth circles for ceremonial purposes. What exactly did this human do to them? Before Bolt could answer, Thane stood with the deliberate movements of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Counselor, what we're witnessing is the inevitable result of abandoning proper military discipline in favor of emotional coddling. The Cubs have become psychologically dependent on a single individual. which makes them useless as military assets. General, Bolt's voice carried a warning edge. I wouldn't recommend describing Ursid cubs as assets to their parents. But Thane was on a roll, his confidence restored by the apparent vindication of his position. Commander, this situation perfectly illustrates why humans are unsuited for positions of real responsibility in military education. They lack the emotional detachment necessary for proper training. One of their instructors disappears, and 6 promising young warriors become non-functional. The howling intensified, and somewhere in the distance, something expensive-sounding exploded. That's enough, Bolt said firmly. General, I want you to take direct control of the Cubs' training. Implement whatever disciplinary measures you think are necessary. You have complete authority. Thane's smile was particularly unpleasant. With pleasure, Commander. What happened next became the subject of Academy legend, though not for the reasons anyone expected. Thane's approach to correcting the Cubs' behavior was everything his Saurian military background had taught him was proper and effective. Rigid schedules, harsh consequences for non-compliance, physical conditioning designed to build strength through adversity, and absolute emotional detachment from instructors. The Cubs lasted exactly 4 hours. What had been distressed howling became something that transcended species barriers entirely. A sound of such profound psychological anguish that it triggered sympathy responses in creatures who had never even seen an Ursid before. The crystalline faculty began flickering in patterns associated with grief. The aquatic instructors refused to leave their deep-water quarters. Even the notoriously stoic insectoid medical staff began displaying signs of emotional distress. Sir! Nyx's compound eyes were literally streaming as she entered Bolt's office. I need to report that the Cubs are entering what appears to be a catatonic state. They're not eating, they're barely responsive to external stimuli, and their vital signs are becoming dangerously unstable. Bolt looked at the data she handed him and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The Cubs weren't just having behavioral problems, they were shutting down completely, their bodies entering a state that looked disturbingly like the early stages of dying from grief. How is this possible? He asked. They're just children missing one instructor. Commander, Nyx's voice carried the careful precision of someone delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. I've been reviewing Ursid psychological development patterns. Cubs who are removed from their pack structures before reaching emotional maturity can experience what their culture calls circle break, a psychological trauma so severe it can be permanently damaging or even fatal. The implications hit Bolt like a physical blow. Are you telling me that the Cubs aren't just homesick? They're literally dying from separation anxiety? Not from being away from their homeworld, Nyx clarified, but from losing their pack bonds. Lieutenant Fay somehow replaced their family circle, and when she disappeared suddenly without the proper transitional protocols, she didn't need to finish. Bolt understood. The Cubs hadn't just bonded with Fay, she'd become their surrogate pack leader, their emotional anchor in a terrifying and unfamiliar environment. Losing her hadn't been a setback in their training. It had been a psychological catastrophe. And General Thane's disciplinary approach is making everything exponentially worse, Nyx said bluntly. Ursid Cubs in circle break need comfort and stability to recover. Additional stress and isolation will likely kill them. The sound of approaching footsteps announced Thane's arrival. The Saurian general entered with his usual swagger, but there was something forced about his confidence now. Commander, he said, I've temporarily suspended active training for the Cubs. They appear to be having some kind of cultural adjustment difficulties that are interfering with their ability to respond to proper instruction. General, Bolt's voice was very quiet. Medical Officer Nix just informed me that your proper instruction is likely to result in the death of 6 cubs whose parents happen to be members of the Ursid High Council. Would you care to explain how that advances the Academy's mission? For the first time since Bolt had known him, Thane looked genuinely uncertain. Commander, the cubs are responding abnormally to standard protocols. In my experience, all species eventually adapt to military discipline if it's applied correctly. Your experience, Bolt said, doesn't include dealing with species that can literally die from emotional trauma. The howling had stopped entirely now, replaced by a silence that was somehow worse. It was the quiet of creatures who had given up hope, and it carried through the station like a funeral shroud. Sir, Vex materialized in the doorway, their crystalline form now a pale, colorless transparency that indicated complete emotional exhaustion. Incoming priority transmission from Earth. Lieutenant Fay is requesting permission to return immediately. She says she can hear them calling for her. Bolt stared at the communication panel. What do you mean, she can hear them? Unknown, sir. But she's demanding emergency transport back to the station. She says the cubs are in danger, and it's her fault for leaving without proper preparation. The pieces of a much larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place in Bolt's mind. Fay's success with the cubs hadn't been a fluke or a temporary behavioral modification. She'd somehow formed a genuine pack bond with them, the kind of deep psychological connection that Ursids normally reserved for immediate family. It was unprecedented. It was completely outside any known xenobiological parameters, and it was apparently the only thing standing between 6 cubs and a form of psychological trauma that could literally kill them. Get her back here, Bolt ordered. Emergency priority, fastest transport available, and get me a direct line to the Ursid High Council. I think we need to have a very different conversation about what's really happening here. As Vex hurried to comply, Bolt found himself staring at General Thane, whose expression had shifted from confident superiority to something approaching genuine concern. Commander, Thane said slowly, if the cub's survival depends on emotional attachment to a specific individual, then perhaps human training methods aren't the weakness I assumed them to be. It was the closest thing to an admission of error that Bolt had ever heard from the Saurian general, and it came just as the Academy's entire understanding of military education was about to be turned completely upside down. Fay's return was nothing like a standard military arrival. She didn't report to the docking bay commander or follow proper check-in procedures. Instead, she ran through the corridors of Nexus Prime like someone racing to prevent a disaster, ignoring startled looks from faculty and cadets alike. The cubs knew she was coming before she reached their quarters. Their howling shifted from the death keen of circle break to something that could only be described as desperate joy. By the time Fay burst through their door, all 6 cubs were on their feet, swaying weakly but alive with anticipation. "Oh, you beautiful idiots," Fay whispered as they surrounded her, careful not to knock her down with their enthusiasm, but clearly needing to touch her, to confirm she was real. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have prepared you properly." Within an hour, the cubs were eating again. Within 3 hours, they were engaging with other species for the first time since her departure. And within 6 hours, Fay was standing in Commander Bolt's office with a proposal that would revolutionize everything the Academy thought it knew about military training. "The cubs weren't the real test," she said simply. They were never meant to succeed under traditional protocols. This whole situation was designed to see if humans could develop new approaches to multi-species military education. Bolt stared at her. That's impossible. The Ursid High Council specifically requested. The Ursid High Council knew exactly what would happen when they sent cubs instead of adolescents, Faye interrupted. Ursids don't send their young to military training until they're emotionally mature enough to handle separation from their circles. These cubs were specifically chosen because they would fail under conventional methods. The implications hit Bolt like a quantum torpedo. You're saying this was a setup? That we were meant to fail? Not fail, Faye corrected. Adapt. The Galactic Alliance has been using the same military training protocols for thousands of years, but they only work for species that develop emotional detachment naturally. What about species that thrive on connection? What about creatures whose strength comes from bonds rather than individual achievement? Before Bolt could respond, his communication panel activated. The familiar forms of the Ursid High Council appeared, but this time they were joined by representatives from dozens of other species, the entire Galactic Alliance leadership. Commander Bolt, the lead Ursid counselor's voice carried an entirely different tone now. We believe it's time for full disclosure. Lieutenant Faye is correct. The cubs were never intended to succeed under traditional training methods. The Alliance has been observing humanity's integration for the past year, added a crystalline representative whose form sparkled with what appeared to be amusement. Your species' approach to education, your emphasis on emotional intelligence and adaptive methods, these represent a fundamental shift in how we might approach military cooperation. General Thane, who had been standing rigid throughout this revelation, finally found his voice. You're telling us that my disciplinary methods were expected to fail? General, the Ursid counselor replied with what might have been gentle humor. Your methods are excellent for species that develop resilience through individual challenge, but they would literally kill cubs whose survival depends on pack bonds. We needed to see if humans could develop protocols that work for emotional cooperation rather than emotional detachment. Faye stepped forward. The cubs taught me something crucial. Military strength doesn't have to come from breaking down individual weaknesses. It can come from building up collective bonds. What if we created training programs based on how different species actually learn and thrive? Impossible, Thane said automatically, then stopped himself. That would require completely restructuring everything. Yes, said a voice from the communication panel that Bolt didn't recognize. The speaker was an elderly human with insignia indicating High Alliance Command. Admiral Chen, Alliance Military Command. Lieutenant Faye, your success with the Cubs has convinced us to implement what we're calling the Human Protocol across all Alliance military training facilities. The next few hours passed in a blur of technical discussions, protocol revisions, and what could only be described as controlled chaos. Faye found herself at the center of planning sessions that would affect military training throughout the galaxy. Her solution was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of forcing all species to adapt to one training method, the Academy would develop individualized protocols based on each species' psychological and social development patterns. Some species would still thrive under traditional discipline. Others would need pack-based learning. Still others might require entirely different approaches that hadn't been invented yet. The Cubs will stay, Faye announced during the final planning session, but they'll be part of a mixed species training unit. Fen has already bonded with 2 crystalline cadets who were struggling with individual combat training. Maw is helping a group of aquatic students understand pack coordination strategies. Thane, who had been largely silent during the reorganization discussions, finally spoke up. "Lieutenant, I owe you an apology. I assumed human methods were inferior because they were different from my own experience. I was wrong." "General," Fay replied with a smile, "your methods aren't wrong either. They're just designed for different species. What we're building here is bigger than any one approach." 3 months later, Nexus Prime Academy had become something unprecedented in galactic history. Training schedules were organized around the biological and psychological needs of dozens of different species. Cubs learned alongside adolescents who learned alongside adults, each group following protocols designed for their developmental stage and social structure. The howling was still there, but now it was part of a complex symphony of sounds, crystalline harmonic resonance during meditation periods, aquatic song learning during coordination training, and yes, Ursid pack calls during their scheduled bonding time. Commander Bolt stood in his office, watching through the reinforced windows as Fay led a mixed-species training exercise. 6 Ursid cubs worked alongside Saurian adolescents, crystalline younglings, and human cadets, each group contributing their natural strengths to collective problem-solving scenarios. "Sir," Vex materialized beside him, their crystalline form now cycling through colors that indicated contentment and amusement. "Incoming transmission from Alliance Command. They want to know if we can accommodate 300 additional cadets from species requesting the human protocol training." Bolt smiled, watching as Fen carefully helped a struggling crystalline cadet navigate an obstacle course designed for pack cooperation rather than individual achievement. "Tell them yes," he said, "and remind them that all requests for schedule modifications should be submitted at least 1 week in advance. Apparently, we're booked solid through nap time." The cubs only howled when she was gone. But now, with proper scheduling and emotional support protocols, Fay was never really gone. She was part of a system that recognized the simple truth that had eluded military educators for millennia. Strength comes in many forms, and the strongest armies are built on understanding rather than uniformity. The galaxy's military forces would never be the same. And that, everyone agreed, was exactly the point.